Colonel Marcus Winters stepped out of his black sedan and straightened his military dress uniform. The morning sun caught the shine of his polished brass buttons and reflected off the numerous medals decorating his chest. At 52 years old, he carried himself with the confidence of a man who had spent 3 decades commanding respect from soldiers across the globe. The colonel had earned every one of those medals through blood, sweat, and determination. His chest displayed ribbons from the Gulf War, the conflicts in Afghanistan and Iraq, and several peacekeeping missions that most civilians had never heard of. Each colorful strip of fabric told a story of courage, leadership, and sacrifice. But more than the decorations, it was the way he walked that announced his importance to the world. This Tuesday morning in London felt different to Colonel Winters. He had an important meeting scheduled with the Military Liaison Office inside Buckingham Palace. The appointment concerned a new training program that would combine traditional British military protocols with modern American tactical approaches. It was the kind of high-level cooperation that could define the next phase of his already impressive career. As he approached the famous black iron gates of Buckingham Palace, Colonel Winters felt the familiar surge of pride that came with being in the presence of such historical significance. The palace grounds stretched before him like something from a postcard. Tourists clustered around the gates, taking photos and chattering excitedly in dozens of different languages. Street vendors sold miniature Union Jack flags and postcards, while mounted police officers kept a watchful eye on the growing crowd. But what really caught the colonel's attention was the solitary figure standing guard near the palace entrance. The royal guard stood perfectly motionless, in his iconic red tunic and towering black bearskin hat. His white belt and golden buttons gleamed in the morning light. The rifle held at his side seemed like an extension of his body. Everything about the guard's appearance spoke of centuries-old tradition and unwavering discipline. Colonel Winters had seen royal guards before in photographs and documentaries, but never up close. The sight stirred something deep in his military soul. Here was a soldier representing one of the world's oldest and most respected military traditions. The red uniform had been worn by British soldiers for hundreds of years. The bearskin hat was a symbol recognized around the globe as representing elite military service. As he walked closer to the guard, Colonel Winters began to feel that familiar expectation that had followed him throughout his career. Wherever he went in his dress uniform, other military personnel recognized his rank and showed appropriate respect. Junior officers snapped to attention when he passed. Even civilian officials often deferred to his obvious authority and experience. The morning air was crisp and clean, with just a hint of the exhaust fumes that always seemed to hang over central London. Tour buses rumbled past on the street behind him, while camera flashes popped constantly as visitors tried to capture the perfect shot of the famous palace and its guardian. Colonel Winters adjusted his uniform jacket one final time and checked his watch. He still had 20 minutes before his scheduled appointment, which gave him plenty of time to acknowledge a fellow soldier's service. In his mind, it was not just appropriate but necessary for senior military personnel to recognize the dedication of those serving in ceremonial roles. The distance between them closed with each confident step. Colonel Winters had no way of knowing that this simple encounter would challenge everything he thought he understood about military hierarchy, respect, and true discipline. The proud man in the decorated uniform was about to learn that sometimes the greatest strength comes not from demanding recognition, but from serving with quiet, unwavering dedication to something far greater than oneself. The stage was set for a confrontation that would humble a career officer and reveal the true meaning of duty. Guard James Mitchell had been standing at his post for 2 hours and 15 minutes. His feet remained planted in exactly the same position where he had taken his stance at the beginning of his shift. The red wool of his tunic felt warm against his chest, despite the cool London morning. His bearskin hat sat perfectly straight on his head, weighing nearly 2 pounds, but feeling as natural as his own hair after 8 years of service. 26-year-old James had dreamed of becoming a Royal Guard since he was a small boy visiting London with his grandmother. She had pointed to the soldiers in their red uniforms and told him they were the bravest men in all of Britain. That memory had stayed with him through school, through his initial military training, and through 2 dangerous tours of duty in Afghanistan, where he had earned his place among the elite soldiers chosen for palace duty. The selection process for Royal Guards was brutal and unforgiving. Out of hundreds of applicants, only a handful were chosen each year. They had to demonstrate not just physical strength and military skill, but also the mental discipline to stand motionless for hours regardless of weather conditions, distractions, or provocation. James had spent months learning to control every muscle in his body, to breathe steadily, and to keep his mind focused despite anything happening around him. During his time on duty, James had experienced almost everything imaginable. Tourists had tried to make him laugh by telling jokes or making funny faces. Children had tugged at his uniform while their parents took photos. Drunken visitors had shouted insults or tried to provoke reactions. Through rain, snow, blazing summer heat, and bitter winter cold, he had maintained his position without moving a single inch. But the mental training was even more demanding than the physical requirements. Royal Guards learned to enter a state of focused meditation while remaining completely alert to potential threats. They practiced ignoring distractions while staying aware of everything happening in their immediate area. James could hear conversations happening 50 feet away, while simultaneously monitoring the movements of every person within his field of responsibility. This morning felt different somehow. James noticed the well-dressed military officer approaching from quite a distance. His trained eye immediately identified the man's rank from the insignia on his uniform. Colonel was clearly visible on the shoulder boards. The chest full of medals and ribbons told the story of a career soldier with extensive combat experience and significant achievements. James had great respect for senior military officers. His own father had been a career soldier, reaching the rank of major before retiring. Growing up in a military family had taught him the importance of hierarchy, discipline, and proper military courtesy. But his current duty as a Royal Guard operated under completely different rules and protocols than normal military service. The ancient traditions governing Royal Guard duty dated back hundreds of years. These protocols had been established by kings and queens to ensure the absolute protection and dignity of the monarchy. While on ceremonial duty, Royal Guards answered only to the crown and followed procedures that superseded all other military conventions. This was not a matter of disrespect toward other military personnel, but rather a sacred trust that could never be broken or compromised. As the colonel drew closer, James could see the confident stride and expectant expression of a man accustomed to receiving immediate recognition of his authority. The morning sun glinted off the officer's polished medals, while tourists continued to stream past, taking photos and chatting among themselves. James remained perfectly still, his breathing controlled, his posture flawless, and his mind prepared for whatever challenge might come next. The approaching confrontation would test everything James had learned about duty, honor, and the true meaning of service to something greater than oneself. Colonel Winters came to a stop directly in front of Guard Mitchell. The distance between them was less than 3 feet. The colonel's polished black shoes gleamed in the morning sunlight as he planted his feet shoulder-width apart in a classic military stance. His chest puffed out slightly, displaying his impressive collection of medals and ribbons for maximum effect. The tourists around them began to sense that something interesting was about to happen. A family from Germany stopped taking selfies and turned their attention toward the 2 military men. An elderly couple from Scotland paused their morning walk to observe the scene. Several teenagers with backpacks pulled out their smartphones and started recording what they hoped might become a viral video. Colonel Winters cleared his throat and spoke in his most authoritative voice. "Soldier, you will acknowledge your superior officer immediately." His words carried the weight of 30 years of command experience. The tone was firm, confident, and left no room for interpretation. This was not a request, but a direct military order from a senior officer to a subordinate. Guard Mitchell remained perfectly motionless. His eyes stayed fixed straight ahead, looking past the colonel toward the distant gates of the palace. His breathing remained steady and controlled. Not a single muscle in his face moved to acknowledge that he had even heard the command. The red wool of his tunic rose and fell gently with each breath, but otherwise he might as well have been carved from stone. The silence stretched for nearly 30 seconds. Colonel Winters had expected an immediate salute followed by a respectful "Yes, sir," or "Good morning, Colonel." Instead, he found himself staring at a soldier who seemed completely unaware of his presence. The lack of response sent a surge of irritation through the colonel's body. "Did you hear me, soldier?" Colonel Winters said, raising his voice slightly. "I am Colonel Marcus Winters, and I demand the proper military courtesy that my rank deserves." His face began to flush red with a combination of embarrassment and growing anger. Never in his decorated career had any soldier failed to acknowledge his authority. More tourists gathered around the scene. A Japanese tour group stopped their guided walk to watch what was unfolding. Street vendors selling postcards and souvenirs craned their necks to get a better view. Even some of the mounted police officers stationed nearby began paying closer attention to the situation developing near the palace gates. Guard Mitchell's training kicked into high gear. He had been prepared for exactly this type of situation during his months of specialized instruction. Royal Guards regularly faced attempts by various people to break their concentration or force them to abandon their ceremonial duties. Military officers were actually among the most challenging because they often genuinely believed their rank gave them authority over palace guards. But James understood something that Colonel Winters did not. While wearing the red tunic and bearskin hat of a royal guard, he was not simply another soldier in the British Army. He was a guardian of centuries-old traditions. He was a living symbol of the monarchy itself. His duty transcended normal military hierarchy and placed him under the direct protection and authority of the crown. The colonel stepped even closer, reducing the distance between them to less than 2 feet. "Soldier, I am ordering you to salute me right now. This behavior is completely unacceptable and will be reported to your commanding officer." His voice carried across the courtyard, causing more heads to turn in their direction. The confrontation was escalating quickly, and both men were committed to their positions for very different reasons. What Colonel Winters did not understand was the incredible journey that had brought James Mitchell to this moment. The Royal Guards were not ordinary soldiers playing dress-up for tourists. They were among the most elite military personnel in the entire British Armed Forces. Every man wearing the red tunic had proven himself in real combat situations before earning the right to protect the monarchy. James Mitchell had served with distinction in the Parachute Regiment before applying for Royal Guard duty. During his 2 tours in Afghanistan, he had led dangerous night raids, rescued wounded comrades under heavy fire, and shown the kind of courage that earned him recommendations from his commanding officers. The metal ribbons hidden beneath his ceremonial uniform told stories of bravery that most people would never know about. The selection process for Royal Guards was designed to find soldiers who possessed not just physical courage, but also unbreakable mental discipline. Candidates underwent months of psychological evaluation and stress testing. They had to prove they could maintain perfect composure under any circumstances. The training included standing at attention for 6 hours straight in blazing heat, freezing cold, and driving rain without moving a single muscle. During one particularly challenging exercise, James had been required to stand motionless while instructors shouted insults through objects near his feet and created loud, distracting noises around him. Fellow trainees had dropped out of the program when they could not handle the mental pressure. But James had learned to enter a state of focused meditation that allowed him to remain aware of his surroundings while ignoring all attempts to break his concentration. The psychological training was even more demanding than the physical requirements. Royal Guards learned techniques borrowed from elite special forces units for controlling their breathing, heart rate, and muscle tension. They practiced visualization exercises that helped them maintain perfect posture for hours at a time. Most importantly, they internalized the sacred nature of their duty to protect the crown above all other considerations. James had also received extensive education about the history and traditions surrounding his role. He learned about Royal Guards who had stood their posts during the London Blitz while bombs fell around them. He studied accounts of guards who had maintained their duties during royal funerals, state ceremonies, and moments of national crisis. Each story reinforced the understanding that personal comfort, recognition, and even normal military protocol came second to their sworn oath. The bearskin hat on James's head weighed nearly 2 pounds, and could become uncomfortably hot during summer months. The red wool tunic was designed for appearance rather than comfort and could feel stifling on warm days. The rifle he carried was functional and loaded, though most tourists assumed it was merely ceremonial. Every piece of his uniform served both practical and symbolic purposes that connected him to centuries of tradition. Colonel Winters continued his demands, growing more frustrated with each passing moment. His voice became louder and more insistent as he tried different approaches to force a response. "Soldier, your behavior is a disgrace to the uniform you wear. I have commanded thousands of troops, and I will not be ignored by some palace decoration." But James Mitchell was not just some palace decoration. He was a warrior who had chosen to channel his skills and training into service to something greater than personal recognition. His stillness was not weakness, but rather the highest expression of military discipline and dedication. The growing crowd of tourists continued recording the confrontation, completely unaware of the deeper significance of what they were witnessing. The confrontation between Colonel Winters and Guard Mitchell was now attracting serious attention from everyone in the immediate area. What had started as a simple encounter between two military men had transformed into an unexpected spectacle that was drawing crowds like a street performance. A group of American tourists who had been taking photos of the palace architecture quickly shifted their focus to the drama unfolding before them. "Oh my goodness, Martha, are you getting this on video?" whispered one elderly woman to her companion. "This is better than anything we saw at the Tower of London yesterday." The smartphones came out in force as people realized they might be witnessing something that would end up on social media, news websites, or even television broadcasts. A young man from Australia started a live stream on his social media account, providing running commentary to his online followers. "Guys, you are not going to believe what is happening right now at Buckingham Palace," he said, holding his phone steady to capture the scene. Colonel Winters noticed the growing audience and felt his embarrassment deepen. He had not intended to create a public scene, but his military pride would not allow him to simply walk away from what he saw as blatant insubordination. The presence of cameras and recording devices only made him more determined to resolve the situation in a way that preserved his dignity and authority. "Young man," the colonel said, directing his voice toward Guard Mitchell, while simultaneously addressing the crowd, "this soldier is demonstrating a complete lack of military discipline and respect for proper chain of command." He gestured toward his chest, full of medals, hoping the visible evidence of his accomplishments would sway public opinion in his favor. An elderly British gentleman wearing a tweed jacket and carrying a walking stick shook his head disapprovingly. He had lived in London his entire life and understood the protocols surrounding royal guards better than most tourists. "Bloody Americans," he muttered to his wife, though Colonel Winters was actually Canadian. "No respect for our traditions whatsoever." A family from France tried to get closer to take better photos, but were gently moved back by one of the mounted police officers who had been monitoring the situation. The officer spoke quietly into his radio, updating his supervisors about the developing incident. Palace security protocols required immediate notification whenever any situation involving royal guards attracted public attention. Colonel Winters decided to try a different approach. Instead of continuing to demand acknowledgement, he began recounting his military achievements, hoping to demonstrate why he deserved respect. "I have served my country for 30 years, son. I have commanded battalions in 3 different conflicts. I have received commendations for valor and leadership from the highest levels of military command." His voice carried clearly across the courtyard, reaching tourists who were standing 50 feet away. Some people began whispering among themselves, debating whether the colonel was in the right or if there was something they did not understand about the situation. The cultural differences were obvious, as visitors from different countries had varying perspectives on military hierarchy and ceremonial duties. Guard Mitchell remained absolutely motionless throughout the colonel's speech. His eyes stayed fixed on the distant horizon. His breathing remained steady and controlled. Not even the slightest twitch of his facial muscles suggested that he was aware of the increasingly heated monologue being directed at him. The contrast between the two men was striking. Colonel Winters was animated, gesticulating with his hands and moving around as he spoke. His face showed clear signs of frustration and wounded pride. Guard Mitchell was like a statue carved from marble, completely still and seemingly unaffected by the chaos swirling around him. More palace staff members began appearing at various windows and doorways drawn by the commotion outside. Sergeant David Williams had been watching the entire confrontation unfold from his position inside the palace security office. Multiple cameras positioned around the grounds provided him with clear views of everything happening near the main gates. As head of the ceremonial guard detail, he had seen similar situations develop before, but rarely involving someone of Colonel Winter's rank and obvious military experience. The sergeant was a 20-year veteran of the British Army who had earned his current position through a combination of combat experience, administrative skill, and deep understanding of royal protocols. He had served alongside royal guards in various ceremonies and understood better than most people the unique position these soldiers occupied within the broader military structure. Through his radio headset, Sergeant Williams coordinated with other security personnel positioned around the palace grounds. "Control, this is Sergeant Williams. I am going to approach and defuse the situation developing at Post 7. Have backup units standing by but maintain distance unless I specifically request assistance." The response crackled back immediately. "Copy that, Sergeant Williams. We have visual on your position and are monitoring the situation. Tourist crowd is growing, and we are seeing increased activity on social media regarding this incident." Sergeant Williams straightened his uniform and walked purposefully toward the confrontation. His approach was measured and professional, designed to project authority without appearing threatening or aggressive. Years of dealing with diplomatic situations had taught him the importance of body language and tone in diffusing potentially volatile encounters. As he drew closer, he could hear Colonel Winters continuing his increasingly frustrated monologue. "This is absolutely unacceptable behavior from any soldier regardless of his assignment. In my day, military personnel showed proper respect to their superiors without question or hesitation." The sergeant arrived at the scene and positioned himself slightly to the side where he could address both men while remaining visible to the growing crowd of onlookers. His presence immediately changed the dynamic of the situation, as both Colonel Winters and the surrounding tourists recognized that official palace security had become involved. "Good morning, Colonel," Sergeant Williams said in a clear, respectful voice that carried just enough authority to command attention. "I am Sergeant Williams, head of ceremonial security. I understand there may be some confusion about our protocols here at the palace." Colonel Winters turned toward the sergeant with obvious relief. Finally, here was someone who might help him resolve this embarrassing situation in a way that preserved his dignity and military standing. "Sergeant, I am Colonel Marcus Winters, and this soldier has shown complete disrespect for military hierarchy and proper conduct." The sergeant nodded respectfully, acknowledging the colonel's rank and concern, while carefully considering his response. He understood that this situation required delicate handling to avoid creating an even larger incident that might damage relationships between different branches of the military or create negative publicity for the palace. "Colonel, I can see that you are a decorated officer with extensive service experience," Sergeant Williams replied, gesturing toward the impressive display of medals and ribbons on the colonel's chest. "Your concern for proper military conduct is completely understandable and appreciated." A crowd of tourists pressed closer, hoping to hear the explanation that might resolve the confusing confrontation they had been witnessing. Smartphones continued recording every word and gesture as people realized they might be witnessing something historically significant, or at least entertaining enough to share with friends and family. Guard Mitchell remained perfectly still throughout this exchange. His eyes stayed fixed straight ahead, and his posture never wavered, despite the fact that he was now the center of attention for dozens of people and multiple conversations about his conduct and duty. Sergeant Williams prepared to deliver the explanation that would either resolve the conflict or potentially make it much worse, depending on how Colonel Winters chose to receive the information. Sergeant Williams took a deep breath and prepared to explain something that very few people outside the palace walls truly understood. The moment had come to reveal the reality behind the Royal Guard protocols that governed this entire situation. His words would either educate Colonel Winters about ancient traditions or potentially create an even more difficult confrontation. Colonel, with all due respect, I need to explain something about Royal Guard duty that may not be immediately obvious. The sergeant began, speaking clearly so that both the colonel and the gathered crowd could hear his explanation. When these soldiers are on ceremonial duty, they operate under protocols that have been in place for hundreds of years. Colonel Winters crossed his arms and waited for what he expected would be a reasonable explanation followed by appropriate corrective action. He had served in joint operations with British forces before and had always found their military personnel to be professional and respectful of rank structures. This situation seemed like an aberration that could be quickly resolved. Royal Guards, while on ceremonial duty, answered directly to the Crown Sergeant Williams, continued maintaining his diplomatic but firm tone. Their protocols during these assignments supersede all other military conventions, including normal chain of command structures. The colonel's eyebrows rose in surprise. "Are you telling me, Sergeant, that this soldier's duty to stand still is more important than acknowledging the rank and authority of a superior officer?" His voice carried a mixture of disbelief and growing understanding that this situation was more complex than he had initially assumed. "Yes, sir, that is exactly what I am telling you," Sergeant Williams replied without hesitation. "These guards have sworn an oath that places their ceremonial duties above all other considerations while they are on post. They cannot and will not break character or abandon their protocols for any reason short of an immediate threat to the royal family." The crowd of tourists listened intently as this explanation unfolded. Many of them had traveled thousands of miles specifically to see the famous Royal Guards and were now learning something about these soldiers that most guidebooks never mentioned. The smartphones continued recording as people realized they were witnessing an educational moment about British military traditions. Colonel Winters felt his worldview shifting slightly as the implications of this information sank in. "So you are saying that while wearing that uniform this soldier outcranks me in terms of his duties and responsibilities?" The question came out more quietly than his previous demands as he began to process what he was learning. "Not exactly, Colonel," Sergeant Williams replied carefully. "Rank is still rank, and your service and achievements deserve recognition and respect. But while on ceremonial duty, Royal Guards follow a completely separate command structure that places them under the direct authority of the monarchy, rather than normal military hierarchy." An elderly British woman in the crowd nodded approvingly at the sergeant's explanation. She remembered stories her grandfather had told her about Royal Guards who had maintained their posts during World War II air raids. "My grandfather served in the war," she said loudly enough for others to hear. "He always said the palace guards were the finest soldiers in the empire." The revelation was clearly having an impact on Colonel Winters. His rigid military posture began to relax slightly as he looked back at Guard Mitchell with new understanding. The soldier was not being insubordinate or disrespectful. He was following ancient protocols that predated modern military rank structures by centuries. These traditions date back to the time of kings and queens who needed absolute assurance that their personal guards could not be influenced, commanded, or compromised by anyone other than the sovereign, Sergeant Williams explained. "It is actually one of the highest honors in British military service to be selected for Royal Guard duty." The educational moment was transforming the entire atmosphere of the confrontation from tension to understanding. The transformation in Colonel Winters was visible to everyone watching the scene unfold. His shoulders relaxed from their rigid military bearing, and his face softened as the anger and embarrassment gave way to something approaching admiration. He looked back at Guard Mitchell with completely different eyes, seeing not an insubordinate soldier, but a man performing one of the most demanding duties in military service. "I had no idea," Colonel Winters said quietly, speaking more to himself than to anyone else. "In 30 years of military service, I have never encountered anything quite like this." He paused for a moment, studying the perfect stillness and discipline of the Royal Guard. The level of training and mental discipline required for this duty must be extraordinary. Sergeant Williams seized the opportunity to continue educating the colonel and the gathered crowd about the reality of Royal Guard service. These men undergo some of the most rigorous selection and training processes in the entire British military. Most of them are combat veterans who have served with distinction in active war zones before earning the privilege of palace duty. A young boy in the crowd tugged on his father's sleeve and whispered loudly enough for others to hear, "Daddy, is that soldier a real warrior?" The father smiled and nodded, "Yes, son, he is one of the best soldiers in the world." Colonel Winters walked slowly around Guard Mitchell, maintaining a respectful distance while observing the incredible discipline being displayed. Not a single muscle twitched despite the extended confrontation and growing crowd. The colonel began to understand that he was witnessing something truly remarkable rather than simple stubbornness or disrespect. "How long do they maintain this position?" Colonel Winters asked Sergeant Williams, with genuine curiosity replacing his earlier frustration. "And how do they prepare mentally for such demanding duty?" Guard shifts typically last 2 to 4 hours depending on weather conditions and special events, the sergeant explained. But during state ceremonies or important occasions they may remain at post for much longer periods. The mental preparation involves meditation techniques, breathing exercises, and years of practice maintaining focus despite any distractions. The crowd had grown to nearly 50 people as word spread among tourists that something interesting was happening near the palace gates. Tour guides began incorporating the scene into their presentations, explaining to their groups about the unique role of royal guards in British military tradition. Colonel Winters found himself genuinely impressed by what he was learning. "In combat situations, we train soldiers to maintain alertness and discipline under extreme stress," he said thoughtfully. "But this requires a completely different type of mental strength. Standing perfectly still while remaining fully aware of surroundings and potential threats." "Exactly," Colonel Sergeant Williams agreed. "These guards must be prepared to transition instantly from ceremonial duty to active protection if any threat to the royal family is detected. They are not just symbols or tourist attractions. They are elite soldiers performing a vital security function." An older gentleman from Scotland who had been listening to the conversation stepped forward slightly. "My son served as a royal guard 15 years ago," he said proudly. "The training nearly broke him, but it made him the finest soldier I have ever known. These lads are special." The educational moment continued as Sergeant Williams offered Colonel Winters an opportunity to observe the changing of the guard ceremony that would take place in 30 minutes. "Sir, if you would like to see these protocols in action, the ceremonial changing of the guard provides an excellent demonstration of their precision and dedication." Colonel Winters nodded enthusiastically. "I would be honored to observe that ceremony, Sergeant. This has been quite an education for me." He looked once more at Guard Mitchell with obvious respect and admiration. "I apologize for not understanding the situation earlier." The crowd began to disperse slightly as people realized the confrontation had been resolved peacefully and educational rather than dramatic. But many smartphones continued recording as the story had taken an unexpectedly positive turn. The changing of the guard ceremony began exactly on schedule 30 minutes later. Colonel Winters positioned himself among the crowd of tourists, but with a completely different perspective than when he had first arrived at the palace gates. He watched with the trained eye of a military professional as the precision drill unfolded before him with clockwork accuracy. The ceremony was a masterpiece of military choreography. Every step, every turn, and every movement had been rehearsed thousands of times until it became second nature. The guards moved in perfect synchronization, their red tunics and bearskin hats creating a striking visual display that had remained unchanged for generations. Colonel Winters found himself genuinely moved by the dedication and skill on display. When Guard Mitchell was finally relieved of his post after nearly 4 hours of motionless duty, the colonel approached him at a respectful distance. James was now able to move and speak normally, though he remained in full ceremonial uniform. The contrast between his perfect stillness during duty and his normal human behavior afterward was remarkable to witness. "Guard Mitchell," Colonel Winters said formally, "I owe you a sincere apology. I misunderstood the nature of your duty and the protocols that govern your service." His voice carried genuine respect and humility that had replaced his earlier frustration and wounded pride. James Mitchell looked directly at the colonel for the first time. His eyes were clear and alert, showing no signs of fatigue despite his extended period of motionless concentration. "No apology necessary, sir," he replied with quiet professionalism. "We all serve our countries in different ways, but we all serve with honor and dedication to something greater than ourselves." The simple elegance of Guard Mitchell's response struck Colonel Winters deeply. Here was a young soldier who had endured public confrontation and potential embarrassment without breaking character or showing any resentment. Instead, he responded with grace, dignity, and understanding that spoke to the highest ideals of military service. "Your discipline and dedication are truly impressive," Colonel Winters said, extending his hand toward the guard. "In 30 years of military service, I have rarely encountered such unwavering commitment to duty. You and your fellow guards represent the finest traditions of military excellence." James Mitchell accepted the handshake firmly. "Thank you, Colonel. Your service record and achievements speak for themselves. It is an honor to meet a fellow soldier who has dedicated his life to serving others." The mutual respect between the two men was obvious to everyone still watching the interaction. Sergeant Williams approached the two men with a satisfied expression. The situation had been resolved in the best possible way, with both military professionals gaining appreciation for each other's service and sacrifice. "Gentlemen, this has been handled with the professionalism I would expect from soldiers of your caliber," he said approvingly. As Colonel Winters prepared to leave for his scheduled meeting inside the palace, he took one final look at the royal guards who had resumed their ceremonial duties. He now understood that their stillness was not passive but active. Their silence was not empty but full of purpose. Their duty was not symbolic but vital to the security and dignity of the monarchy they served. Walking toward the palace entrance, Colonel Winters reflected on the lesson he had learned about duty, respect, and the many different ways that military personnel serve their countries. Sometimes the greatest strength comes not from commanding others, but from serving with quiet, unwavering dedication to principles and traditions that transcend personal recognition or glory. The tourists who had witnessed the entire encounter would go home with a story about the day they learned something profound about honor, duty, and the true meaning of service. The videos they had recorded would spread across social media not as entertainment, but as education about the remarkable men who guard Britain's royal family with ancient traditions and modern excellence. Guard Mitchell returned to his post, ready to stand motionless for hours more if duty required it.